So, welcome to everyone to this Radical Geography seminar, the 7th in our series this year, in a day that we all remember in Greece, the 7-year dictatorship. As of today, 54 years ago, we lost our democracy, and it's really a day that we remember friends and relatives that have suffered during those 7 years. And we are very glad to have Professor Erik Swyngedouw with us today. Erik is professor at the Manchester University, a well-known radical geography internationally, and also a year-long very good friend. We share a lot of things together with Erik, among which is the very difficult last name of ours, English speakers. That's true. I mean, when we are in different meetings and conferences, Erik and myself, we have always difficulties for friends from English-speaking countries to pronounce our last name correctly. Anyway, Erik has been a regular visitor to Greece and an excellent contributor to all the events that we had organized. And together with his ideas, which always inspire us on difficult areas and in difficult fields, we share also your very long and difficult titles of presentations, and something like that happens today. Please remember the title: "The Apocalypse is Disappointing, the Depoliticized Deadlock of Climate Change Consensus." So with those little words, we thank him a lot. We look forward to hear what he has to say. And Erik, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kostis, for your introduction, and thank you very much, all of you, for inviting me to share my thoughts with you.
Erik, before you start, may I say just a couple of practical things for the people who are just...
By all means, by all means.
Okay, so since this is going to be in English, the whole seminar is going to be in English, we would like to ask you to ask your questions in English too. And you can either use Facebook, or you can ask your questions, or you can use the chat here on Zoom and ask your questions there. Αν κάποιος νιώθει πολύ δύσκολα στα αγγλικά να εκφραστεί, γράψε την ερώτηση σας στα ελληνικά, δεν έγινε τίποτα, θα τη μεταφράσω και τη διαβάσω εγώ στα αγγλικά, αλλά γενικά μας διευκολύνεται αν τα γράψετε κατευθείαν στα αγγλικά. Just keep your microphones off so that we don't have background noise. We generally end in about 90 minutes to almost 2 hours, so we've never been over the 2 hours, just so you have an idea where we are. If you have any practical questions, send me a direct message please in the chat, and I will try to help you solve it. I'm here to help you with that and take questions, so feel free to write your questions while Erik is speaking. You don't have to wait for the end. All right, so sorry for interrupting, Erik. The floor is yours. But you need to turn on your mic on again.
Indeed. I'm back again. I assume you can all hear me now. Thank you yet again for having me with you this evening, albeit on a distance. I would have preferred much more to be with you in Athens and to go out for dinner and chiparon and raki after the seminar, but I'm afraid that will have to wait until next time. It's always a pleasure, of course, to speak to such a distinguished group of people. First, an apology. I understand that most of the seminars that have been running this spring have been about COVID-19 for obvious reasons. I am not going to speak very much directly about COVID-19. There are many other people who can speak about that with much more competence than I can. Nonetheless, I will be talking about COVID-19's avatar, which is climate change and the wider ecological and environmental conditions that we're all in, even at the moment that COVID-19 will be just a memory and stuff of tales that we will tell after it's all over. Climate change and its ecological, socio-ecological consequences will be with us for many years to come. So my title is, I'm now going to share my screen. I hope you can all see it. There we go. You should, I assume you can all see it. The title is The Apocalypse is Disappointing. The depoliticized deadlock of the climate change consensus. It's going to be a bit of a strange talk. I've never talked about this before. I've written quite a few papers around this theme, but I've never given a seminar about it yet. But it brings together something that I've been thinking about, reading about and writing about over the past few years, which is the following much wider situation than the climate one. The kind of political and theoretical issue that really animates what I'm trying to do today is the following paradox, which can be formulated as follows. Despite the fact that we know very much the truth of the situation, whether it's about capitalism, climate change, the environment, we know the facts. We know the truth of the situation. It's widely known, and that truth is indeed widely shared. It's not any longer a knowledge of a marginal small group of people. It's a widely shared knowledge about the state the Earth is in, that despite that knowledge, we act as if we do not know. So there is, as it were, a constitutive gap between knowing and acting. And it's that gap that I'm interested in exploring. So this is basically the sort of key intellectual and theoretical, but also the practical, the question that I try to address. How can I, oh, yeah. As indeed, Kostis has already said, today is a memorable day for all Greeks. It's 54 years ago that the dictatorship came to power in a coup. 7 years of hard dictatorship, followed by a heroic transformation towards a democratic configuration, transformation in which some of you who were indeed old enough actively participated. If we then fast forward to today, the dictatorship has indeed gone, and the victory of democracy has been quite successful in many ways. But of course, capitalism is still with us. And very few of us who lived through the 60s and the 70s, and for me, the 1974 change had a formative effect in my late teenage years in constructing my radical imaginary that I would nurture for the next decades. But very few then could have imagined the grand success of capitalism in its neoliberal clothing that has so successfully installed itself over the past few decades. It is certainly much wilder than I could have imagined in the wildest of my imaginations in the 1970s. And of course, that has also been associated with the rise of new forms of authoritarianism. So it is important in days like this to stand still for a moment and reflect on it. As I said, I'm not going to address COVID-19 explicitly. There are others who are much better placed to do so. But I do think that what I'm going to talk about has quite a few relationships with the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm going to talk about the non-politics of climate change, or the deadlock in which the climate change situation finds itself today. And there are actually quite interesting, I think, affinities between the climate change conundrum that we're in and the COVID-19 condition. Put simply, COVID-19, the COVID-19 pandemic, not the virus, but the pandemic, of course, exposes the capitalist nature society problematic. It's not difficult to see how the COVID-19 pandemic, its speed, its social and ecological triaging is closely interconnected with the dynamics of capitalist globalization as it unfolded over the past few decades. So in that sense, Corona, the virus, and CO2, I both consider them as symptoms of the capitalist world's socio-environmental condition. It's not a cause of anything, it's a symptom of the situation that we are in. And both are actually very, very good illustrations of the symptom of capitalism. So my focus is going to be on COVID-19's avatar, as I call it, the climate change. The latter, climate change, will still be wreaking havoc when COVID-19 will have been relegated to memories and storytelling. And indeed, I would argue that the parallels between them are too striking to ignore. As I will say later, I will talk about what Roberto Esposito calls immuno-biopolitical governance as one of the key governance arrangements that are dominant in the present neoliberal order, and the climate change governance, the dominant climate change governance arrangements very much reflect what Esposito calls an immuno-biopolitical governance regime. And of course, that has been even further intensified during the COVID-19 pandemic. It's a classic example of an immunological biopolitics that has been pursued over the past year or so. And as I said in my introduction, the main focus, I hope it will have a focus that remains to be seen. But what I'm really interested in is the irreducible gap between knowledge, the knowledge that is out there, and political action. The hole in the middle. As we all know, I mean, our generation, my generation at least, has grown up, and I'm certainly not the only one, in the strong belief that the politics of knowledge are absolutely vital in structuring a politics of transformation. Knowledge and action, so the assumption went, was all closely together. That's why we were all, many of us, so keen on a good analysis, a knowledge of capitalism through Marxist and other perspectives, in the conviction that that knowledge, the truth of the situation, will open up a specter for the political action. I'm not any longer that sure about it. So I'm going to question the politics of knowledge. I'm going to argue that the politics of knowledge has become completely ineffective, and that we might want, instead of a politics of knowledge, try to think through a politics of enjoyment. I'll come to that later. So there's 5 points that I want to make. First of all, I'm going to very briefly indicate what I mean by the deadlock of the climate consensus, the climate impasse, as I would argue that we're currently in. To then try to, in a variety of ways, account for the non-existence of an effective climate politics. I'll do that first by considering a Lacanian Marxist perspective articulated around the question of disavowal and why and how it is that we have succeeded so successfully to put CO2 and greenhouse gases as the kind of object cause of desire, that in order to deal with the climate and the socio-ecological consequence implications of it, we have to deal with greenhouse gases. I would call that a form of fetishistic disavowal. I will also argue that much of the dominant climate discourse, including the environmental discourse sustained by liberals and radicals like us, actually expresses very much what I and others have called a form of climate populism. So I'm asking myself why it is that we, not them, not the Trumps and the Bolsonaros of this world, but that we also often succumb to what I and others have called the climate populism. And then I'll say something about the fantasy of Immuno-Biopolitics, which I borrow from Roberto Esposito, and which I would argue is one of the key dispositives of contemporary neoliberal governance. To then conclude by suggesting that what really needs to be done is to transgress the fantasies that nurture and sustain the dominant climate argument, discourse, and associated practices. So it's really a story about fantasy and imaginaries. Okay. I would argue that we are today in an extraordinary climate impasse, which can be formulated as follows, which is that despite great knowledge about and despite a broad consensus about climate change as a clear and present danger, a consensus that has been painfully constructed, but quite successfully so, over the past 2 decades or so, based on an alliance of activists, scientists, NGOs, international and national political meetings, etc. There is now a broad consensus based on wide and deep knowledge about the fact of climate change, a consensus that is shared across a wide alliance of people from different ideological stripes and colors, to the extent that those few who deny or question climate change are now relegated to the margins of political, cultural, or intellectual respectability. So despite this great achievement, very little, if anything at all, has been achieved. If you look at the climate data, last year, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere reached 413 ppm. That is more than has ever been recorded in the history of the Earth, and that number keeps on going up year after year after year. We are now literally in uncharted territory. The Earth's atmosphere is in a condition for which we have no previous historical experience. Between 1990, which was the year of the first IPCC report, the reports of the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. The first one was published in 1990, and as you know, the IPCC reports have been quite symptomatic in constructing this great and shared concern with the climate. Between 1990 and 2018, the volume of greenhouse gas emissions has increased by 65%. So despite the knowledge, despite the rhetoric, and despite all the local, national, international policies and efforts that have been made, greenhouse gas emissions continue their inexorable decline with an average of about 2 to 3% a year. In fact, yesterday I was reading that the International Energy Agency is estimating that in 2020, a major COVID year, this year, that the rise of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere will be the second highest ever recorded. Now that's quite an extraordinary observation in a context in which it is assumed that international economic activity is slowing down because of the pandemic. Greenhouse gas emissions are growing faster than many years before. So that is what I call a deadlock. There's a concern, an agreement, broadly shared agreement that something needs to be done, and that in the reality of the actual biophysical composition of the atmosphere, situation gets worse day after day after day. So that's what I call a depoliticized deadlock. And it's that deadlock that I want to talk about or talk around. Why is it there? How can we think it? And I'm going to do that from a broadly Marxist Lacanian perspective, in which I'm basically going to argue we have to move somehow, or not move necessarily, we have to think politics not only as something that is and should be sustained by knowledge, but something that is also sustained and nurtured by enjoyment in a psychoanalytic sense of the word. So just to further illustrate that situation, Kevin Anderson, who is a internationally renowned climate scientist at the Tyndall Center, he's a climatologist. He said a few years ago, we have here delivered 3 decades of abject failure, a litany of technocratic fraud has marked climate policy. Now that's quite a serious allegation. And of course illustrates the political impotence of climate action, or the political impotence so far of any significant or meaningful climate action. In fact, Alain Badiou, the communist Marxist philosopher in 2008, already argued how a single-sided focus on the question of nature and the environment is in itself a depoliticizing act. He said, and I quote, "Let's start by stating that after the rights of man, the rise of the rights of nature is a contemporary form of the opium of the people. It's an only slightly camouflaged religion. It's a gigantic operation in the depoliticization of subjects." So he, Badiou, is in a certain way scandalously reformulating Marx's famous statement about the religion in the late 19th century and replacing religion with nature. So from this empirical base, I would now like to explore some of the possible reasons for this cognitive dissonance that exists. The cognitive dissonance is a psychological term that refers to the constitutive split between knowing and acting. It is the process that psychoanalysts refer to as fetishistic disavowal, which can basically be formulated as follows. Despite the fact that I know very well the facts of climate change and the need for an ecologically sensible and socially just society, I nonetheless act as if I do not know. So in other words, the fetishistic disavowal refers to the process whereby the real, what Lacan would call the real of the situation, which is capitalist and antagonisms as the key obstacle to the situation, and the desire to change those capitalist antagonism if we want to deal with the climate situation and the socio-ecological injustices associated with it, that is displaced onto something else. That's something else that becomes the stand-in for that bigger and apparently unachievable desire, that is to transform the coordinates of the socio-ecological dynamics of capitalism. This displaced thing around which the desire for a more ecologically sensible and socially more inclusive society circulates, that displaced thing is what Jacques Lacan calls the object cause of desire. So what I and some others would argue is that CO2 and other greenhouse gases in general, operate as such a fetish object. So the fantasy and desire for a different, allegedly better society becomes framed around handling CO2, which becomes named and identified as the privileged object that needs to be handled and managed in order to redirect the history of the future. In other words, it is about managing, handling that thing that is put forward as the object cause of the obstacle to transition, and that displaces the focus from the real mechanisms and processes through which that thing becomes constituted. Now, this disavowal or repression, this fetishistic displacement of the desire for change from the political terrain to that thing like object CO2 has powerful consequences. Because it permits to take the climate question seriously. No one would deny indeed that greenhouse gases are co-responsible for producing the climate dynamics the Earth is in. It permits, secondly, by taking the climate seriously, to situate the solution to the problem within the contours of technical and managerial institutional governance, so that, thirdly, no fundamental change has to be contemplated or implemented in the existing socio-ecological power relationships. So we can save the world and make sure that things can continue to go on as normal. And it's precisely this disavowal or repression, I would argue, that depoliticizes environmental matters. It is this situation that around which I would argue, together with others, a politics of enjoyment revolves. That is, we can maintain our libidinal attachment to the particular socio-ecological world we inhabit, capitalism, and our particular enjoyment we derive of being part of that, including being critics of it. Critiquing it is a very enjoyable activity too. So in other words, we like, love, enjoy too much, including the pain that it brings the world that we're in, and we can keep our soul white, green, or red, as the case may be. Secondly, the mad dance of accumulation and its constitutive class dynamics, as David Harvey would call it, as the real mechanism that produces the socio-ecological catastrophe that we are in, can be ignored and displaced onto the terrain of its symptom. Hence CO2, greenhouse gas, here as the symptom that needs to be managed, such that the mad dance can continue. So that's why people like Slavoj Žižek, for example, would consider many forms of climate activism, obsessive climate activism, occasionally from the likes of Extinction Rebellion or Youth for Climate and Greta Thunberg, can actually be considered as forms of impotent acting out. And of course, much of the depoliticization of environmental matters is further signified through the mobilization and the consensualization of a whole series of what I and others would call depoliticizing, radically empty signifiers that are completely devoid of any political meaning, such as sustainability, mitigation, adaptation, transition, or resilience. These are precisely the consensualized ecological metaphors and signifiers that are being mobilized to sustain this particular consensus structured around the fetishized displacement that I just mentioned, that have become, as it were, the key anchors around which the socio-ecological condition and its analysis circulates. So I would argue that this particular form of fetishistic displacement gets discursively structured in what I and others would call forms of climate populism. In other words, I would argue that the dominant, there are exceptions, not all, but the dominant hegemonic discourse surrounding climate change is strictly parallel to other forms of populist discourses. So I would argue in many ways that the dominant climate discourse revels in a sort of post-truth depoliticization. In other words, it's not just the Trumps and the Bolsonaros and the Golden Dawns of this world that mobilize populist discourses and associated practices. Much of the climate and environmental argument and discourse precisely represents forms of populism too. So while I go to some of the characteristics of climate populism, which I consider to be the dominant discourse, just compare them with what you know about racist or anti-migration populist discourses. I maintain that the structure of nationalist, xenophobic populist discourses on the one hand, and the structure of the dominant climate environmental discourse is structurally similar. So for me, climate populism is about the portrayal of the climate situation as a global and universal humanitarian threat. It's a danger that affects all the people. It's consequently and secondly constructed as a struggle between, on the one hand, us, the people, and the enemy, in this case, the dam of the greenhouse gases. This process externalizes socio-ecological conflicts and struggles to the domain of nature. It displaces or externalizes socio-ecological relations, conflict dynamic to the non-social, non-human world. And in doing so, it reinforces the nature-society split or dichotomy. Fourth, it is predicated upon a certain fantasy of a past ideal. That is the past, the climate of the past. In fact, the IPCC, the report situates the ideal, the climate sometime in 1989. The past is constructed and portrayed as an idealized terrain to recapture, to go back to. The enemy, in this case, greenhouse gases, fifthly, is conceived as an intruder. Think of the migrant here. He was also conceived as an intruder that corrupted the system. And therefore, that needs to be annihilated or managed in order to restore balance and order that was originarily there, but has now been made to disintegrate. The solution, that is the annihilation or the management of the enemy, that corrupted the system, that solution is found in the pathological phenomena, that is excessive greenhouse gases, the remedy for which, the pharmacon, resides within the system itself. That is the very mechanisms that produced the system to begin with, or almost hegemonically mobilized as the mechanisms that will be allegedly successful in finding solutions. That is the combination of eco-technological transformation and transition combined with often market-conform socio-institutional arrangements. The climate consensus is conjured in the name of the people. Now, we have to be concerned with it in the name of the people, and that concern and consensus is supported by an assumedly neutral expertocracy. And of course, that disavows the radical heterogeneities and tensions that cut through the people. That is the radical heterogeneities and tensions that render the people inexistent. In other words, as I'll say in my conclusions, the idea of the people is a fantasy. In the real out there, the people do not exist. In fact, as we know, if we take the example of COVID-19, people from minority groups in the UK have 4 times more chance to get seriously ill or die than people from white majority backgrounds. Classic example. Same is true, of course, of the effect of climate change. Climate populism also does not call for the transformation of the socio-ecological order, but is a call on the elites to undertake action such that the socio-ecological order can be sustained. Take Greta Thunberg when she addressed the United Nations and accused the assorted and assembled elites at the United Nations. You have stolen my dream and my world. Her words, which is precisely in order to spur the elites into action such that she can live her dream in the world that she knows exists but is afraid of losing. Climate populism is also discursively structured in an apparently non-partisan and non-ideological way. And finally, and most importantly, I think there is neither a political name assigned to the climate consensus, nor is a privileged political agent identified. So for me, these are the 10 characteristics that summarize, which are basically the 10 characteristics that you would find in any discussion on populism, right-wing populism, that is striking how the dominant environmental and climate discourse also is structured along populist discursive lines. The key question then is, why is it so successful? Why do we like it so much? Why are we also concerned with the environment and the climate and keep on repeating the kind of discursive structure that I have explained, that I've summarized just now? And a possible way into that is to think through the work of Roberto Esposito and his argument that contemporary governance, contemporary neoliberal governance is characterized by an immuno-biopolitical desire. When I used that word for the first time about 4 or 5 years ago, people found it very strange and I had to explain it in detail. After 1 year of COVID-19, I don't think I have to explain to you what an immuno-biopolitical governance regime is, right? It is a system in which we are sequestered in our homes, or at least some of us, so that others can get infected in order for the social order that we know to remain more or less cohesive. So for Roberto Esposito, the immunitary logic is one that is driven by a desire for immunity or asylum from the obligations and the rights of partaking in community life or life in common. It's a form of radical sequestration, isolation from life in common. Think of, for example, to translate it into environmental terms, the lure of eco-prophylactic, techno-managerial climate governance arrangements, such as sustainable smart cities, eco-cities, sustainable enclaves, ecological gentrification. I sit at this moment in Amsterdam, one of the cities that prides itself as being at the forefront of constructing climate adaptation and resilience. It is soon producing 50% of its energy from wind. But each time I ask them whether they are considering the socio-ecological disaster and disintegration that characterizes the commodity flow of wind turbine production, for example, the coltan exploration around the Great Lakes of Africa. They seem not to have ever thought of it. Amsterdam wants to ban all gasoline-based vehicles by 2030. They will in all likelihood succeed in that. They are massively building an electrical infrastructure for charging electrical vehicles. Already 10% of vehicles in Amsterdam, 35% in Oslo are already electrical. Of course, I do not have to demonstrate or explain what the consequences are of mass battery production on the basis of lithium, what that does for resource extraction, accumulation by dispossession, and socio-ecological disintegration in the lithium mining areas of Chile, for example. So that is precisely what I mean by an immuno-biopolitics. That is the production of eco-pots, e-pots as I like to call it, in some places, which come at an extraordinary socio-ecological cost and socio-ecological disintegration elsewhere. A few months ago, when I was participating in a round table discussion about climate change and cities, in my little presentation, I suggested that, of course, Amsterdam is facing climate risk too as a result of possible sea level rise, to which my hydraulic engineer counterpart, very nice, very intelligent man, said, oh, we hydraulic engineers can deal with 6-meter sea level rise without any difficulty. Don't worry, Amsterdam will be fine in post-apocalyptic times. So I think this law of immuno-biopolitics may help to account for why we, on the one hand, argue for the need for radical change of a technical managerial kind, but at the same time, hold on libidinally to the situation that we are in. And that is structured by what I would argue the injunction, the neoliberal injunction to enjoy. So the greatest concern of immunological biopolitical governance is to maximize the enjoyment of the people. So the depoliticized politics of climate change articulate around an immuno-biopolitical fantasy. That is the fantasy that is structured around the possibility of dealing with the socio-environmental condition without fundamentally altering the socio-ecological relations through which that condition is produced. So for Roberto Esposito, immunological biopolitics is what he calls the concentrated form of neoliberal climate governance. As he said in 2008, the more humans, as well as ideas, languages, and technologies communicate and are bound up with one another, the globalization and its associated flows of things and viruses, etc., the more necessary preventative immunization as counterweight becomes, until it's the coagulating point of contemporary life. And as Garcia said, an immunitary power takes control of the risks, dangers, and fragilities of individuals to make them live in a peaceful manner while obscuring any form of dissensus. So immunity is understood here as the individualized responses obeying the neoliberal injunction to enjoy individual freedom and choice, liberated from the bonds, obligations, and rights upon which the common community life is predicated. So Alain Brossat argued with Roberto Esposito that we're increasingly living in what he calls an immunitary democracy. And if we consider last year's history of the COVID-19 pandemic, it can be easily analyzed and understood in terms of what Brossat already in 2003 called immunitary democracy, which he defines as follows. Immunitary democracy is a fantasy of a total protection and securitization of life without exposure to risk, a prophylactic closure against the socio-physical relations that produce anxiety, uncertainty, and the risk for bodily degradation. For Brossat, this is a dangerous fantasy, as the immunitary logic entails nothing else than the destruction of community, of being in common. It's a politics, he argues, that disavows the political. So governing, Brossat Esposito argues, and I would argue the climate and environmental governing arrangement very much illustrates that. Governing is seen as securing and managing the biological and social integrity of the population. And immuno-biopolitics is a key structuring device in the process of hegemonizing techno-managerial post-politicization. So now in the uneven construction of immunity, the immunized, as Maria Kaika put it a few years ago, again before the COVID pandemic, the immunized become mere spectators of the suffering of others from the cocoon of their sanctuary spaces, from which only hatred of the other, that's the right-wing xeno-nationalist version, or distance compassion with her suffering, that is our liberal stance, appear as flip sides of the same immunitary distanciation. So as Achille Mbembe argues, an immuno-biopolitics corresponds or is paralleled by what he calls the thanatopolitics or the necropolitics. That is, securing the sustainability of life for some is predicated upon the organization of death for others. And again, the COVID-19 condition illustrates that very much. My sanctity space is predicated upon making sure that frontline workers are facing the risk of infection every day in order to assure that my food supply, my clothing supply, my energy supply, my water supply, etc., is sustained, and I can dwell in the sanctity of my immunized epoch. Same can be said, of course, about many of our environmental and ecological interventions, whereby eco-technologies that secure sustainability in one place produce socio-ecological disintegration elsewhere as two sides of the same coin. So the immunitary biopolitics produces what I and others have called a combined and uneven socio-ecological catastrophe. So to begin to conclude now, what I would like to propose is that what is urgently required is to transgress the fantasy upon which much of the environmental and climate discourse, practice, and activism is predicated. That transgressing the fantasy might allow to shift the gaze through which we understand, act, and desire. So transgressing the fantasy, and here we come to the title of my paper, The Apocalypse is Still Disappointing. It's a quote that I stole from Maurice Blanchot. Maurice Blanchot, the communist philosopher who wrote in the early 60s this remarkable paper with this strange title, The Apocalypse is Disappointing, and which I read about 2 years ago and really thought was extremely helpful in understanding some of the fantasies upon which the present environmental discourse is predicated. Of course, Blanchot was not talking about the environmental apocalypse that was looming on the horizon. He was writing in 1962, 1963, and of course, he was writing about the looming apocalypse promised by the Cold War build-up and the danger, the imminent danger of nuclear annihilation. So the point is of thinking through phantasmic displacement is to think through how we can move from knowledge as a political factor, which I try to argue in this talk does not any longer function as a political factor, if it ever did, to enjoyment as a political factor. Or in other words, how can we avoid to have our cake and eat it, because we can't have that? And that is predicated upon displacing that should be you there, our libidinal investment in the capitalist market order, including critiquing it. And the transgression of the fantasies upon which the climate consensus is nurtured and sustained revolves around three key imaginaries upon which much of our thought and action is based and legitimized. The first one is that the socio-ecological and climate situation has to be taken seriously, because if we do not do so, the future of the earth might be catastrophic to such an extent that life as we know it might not any longer be sustainable. In other words, there is the dystopian promise of an apocalypse to come. Of course, it's a future that will never arrive. The apocalyptic future is always postponed a bit longer, and is presented as the legitimation for acting now so that the apocalypse does not happen. Now, what this fantasy displaces or disavows is, of course, the recognition of the already existing combined and uneven socio-ecological catastrophe. That's why the apocalypse, the future apocalypse, is disappointing, because the apocalypse is already here. The socio-ecological catastrophe is already here in the present. It's not a dystopian promise, it's an actually lived reality, but not for everyone. The existing socio-ecological catastrophe is a combined and uneven one. The promise for a potential dystopian apocalyptic future is one that is shared by the elites of the world. So we are already living, as the Invisible Committee put it, in the midst of the disintegration of civilization. We only have to consider the deaths and suffering as a result of actually existing socio-ecological conditions in many places of the world. And again, the COVID-19 condition is a very interesting one. Of course, it is very much an actually existing combined and uneven socio-ecological catastrophe. So that's the first fantasy, a fantasy of an apocalypse to come. Might want to replace that by a reality, by considering the reality of actually existing combined and uneven apocalypse. The second fantasy is the fantasy of humanity. That is that we have to deal with the ecological environmental conditions. So the dominant argument is in order to save humanity in the foreseeable future. This is, of course, predicated upon a strange fantasy that humanity actually exists. And of course, I use the word humanity here not so much as the sum total of individuals living on planet Earth, but I think of humanity more as a shared sense of belonging, being together with shared values, principles, and ideas. The notion of humanity as a common project. As de Blanchot put it, humanity has never existed. The actually existing heterogeneities, struggles, and conflict that cut through the human population exactly testify to the absence of a global humanity, notwithstanding that we do find in localized spots great examples of actually existing humanity. In a global sense, there is no humanity to be saved. In fact, Blanchot argued, and I very much agree with him, is that in fact the absence of humanity that produced the problems the earth is in to begin with. So our only hope here for the future is a fantasy of the possibility of producing a humanity. And that the production of a humanity precisely is a fantasy that might lead to a transformation of socio-ecological relations. So in other words, there is no humanity to be saved. What you might want to think about is, how can we construct a humanity? Because in the absence of a political process of constructing a humanity, the apocalypse may indeed be our share. And then the final fantasy is the fantasy of the people. The people as under threat and risk. But of course, the people in that sense do not exist. The people, again, are split through by all manner of conflicts and tensions, by all manner of inequalities. And it's precisely this radical heterogeneity and the different positionalities that different people take with respect to the combined an uneven socio-ecological configuration that needs to be recognized. So the third fantasy that I think needs to be seriously examined is the fantasy of the people. To then, and to conclude now, what has been, I think, seriously disavowed over the past 30 and 40 years, and to come back to the anniversary of the dictatorship. In the 1960s and 70s, I definitely do not want to go back to the discourses and practices of then, but the great discourses and the fantasies that supported those discourses were political fantasies. Political fantasies that came under the names of communism, socialism, anarchism, communism, etc. These are political fantasies that had a name with an empty content, but which opened up the specter of the production of something different. However phantasmatic these promises were, I would insist that we urgently need to move again from the depoliticizing fantasies that animate so much even of the liberal and progressive discourse and practices to animating again political fantasies. And why not indeed start again with thinking through the fantasy of the possibility of a common, if not communist world as the only hope for the future. I'll leave it with that. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you so much, Erik. Thank you so much for a fantastic talk. As everyone was expecting, you gave us a lot of food for thought. Thanks a lot.
You're very welcome.
Well, I don't know if we have any questions or...
We haven't got any questions on Zoom yet, but please, everybody, feel free to write your questions in the Zoom chat, in English, preferably in Greek, if you haven't got a choice.
So, in order to give room for some people to think about questions and so on, let me add a comment. It's not a question, Erik, because I agree with all what you have said so far. You were speaking about the deadlock and the inability of those elites in power to come with a meaningful solution to the important gap that you mentioned. Let's say knowledge versus action. Of course, elites have some answers to those, but as you said, those answers are within the system.
Sure.
And of course, they reproduce the problem.
Sure.
I mean, green capitalism or new Green Deal or something like that are operating within the system. And I believe together with the dead end to this, let's say, inability to join action to knowledge, you mentioned in the end some political fantasies of the past, but I can see your important point of climate populism, how so well it's adapted across the political spectrum of the day. I mean, even if we speak in Europe, but even speak across Atlantic or all over the world. And I see how, let's say, so-called or self-identified radical parties succumb to those climate populism. And I think, I mean, we have many examples here in Greece. It's not only Syriza, but it's almost all left-wing parties, extra-parliamentary parties.
Yeah.
But of course, climate change and the environmental problem in general are always part of the agenda, or it is totally ignored because for some of them only class struggle makes sense.
Sure. Yeah.
So I think that end that you have identified theoretically, it's 100% applied to the dead end of political solutions from existing political parties, including, let's say, the Greens themselves as a political party. And I'm thinking about the Green program in Germany nowadays and how they speak about climate change. It's really disappointing in terms of a solution that, as you said, is trying to bridge the gap. They don't bridge the gap.
Yes, I fully agree with you, Kostis. And of course, my talk and what I write is not aimed at the elites. I have absolutely no pretense that they will, in whatever way, listen to me, and I've no particular interest that they would listen to me. So my audience, the ones that I'm trying to address, are the climate activists. And I often speak to climate and environmental activists, many of whom are really concerned with the production of an ecologically more sensible and socially more just society. I think here of examples as Extinction Rebellion, Youth for Climate, and many others. So I do not doubt their genuine concern and desire, as they express it, for producing a socio-ecologically different world. Nonetheless, the way they formulate the concern and who they address as the key agents that need to take the concern serious, they further deepen the deadlock that we are in. So my interlocutors here, or the radical environmental activists who I want to say, stop acting as obsessive idiots and start thinking about what it is that you really want. So because here is our only hope, isn't it? In the sense that I agree with you that it's not the existing elite configuration that will change. They will desperately try to make sure that nothing changes, and they will, if they can. I don't think they will succeed, but they will engage in the managerial and technical adjustment that would sustain capitalism a bit longer. But I'm rather more concerned with those who genuinely say they want change. But if I analyze or look at what they say and what they do, I can only conclude that they sustain and deepen the kind of deadlock situation that we are in. And therefore, my invitation is to them to think together about how we might want to shift the terrain through which we say things and the terrain of acting so that we break through that deadlock. So these are the people I'm trying to address, is the radical left activists, of which there are many these days, and I don't want to put them all on the same heap, but I would argue that's what I try to suggest. They're actually actively, unwittingly and unwillingly contributing to the very continuation of the deadlock that I described. So that's the logic.
Kostis, we have one question. Lazarus would like to ask a question. And by the way, you don't have to type your questions in the chat. Of course, you can speak up.
Thanks, Erik. I really enjoyed that. Thanks for allowing me to ask the question as well. I was wondering what you have to say about our conjuncture, actually, play with the title of the presentation. It's not been disappointing for sure. My question relates quite closely with what Kostis was saying just before in terms of climate populism. And as every good question, I think, is both unfair and selfish. Unfair because I'm going to ask you to speculate, and selfish because I've been trying to think about Extinction Rebellion as a kind of climate populism, left-wing climate populism form of politics recently. So I'm not sure, you can probably guess the question. The question is basically, is there any point, can we distinguish between left and right-wing climate populism? Is there anything to be gained from that in the kind of Laclau sense of the kind of thinking around populism? And I don't mean this in the sense of, how I wouldn't go as far as Laclau goes, like every politics is a populist politics, this sort of reasoning, but more in terms of political strategy. So is there anything to gain from a left-wing populist strategy in articulating the different constituent parts making up this humanity that doesn't exist, as you say, and I fully agree, in supporting this communist, egalitarian, anarchist, whatever we might call it, project?
Yes. The answer is simple for me. That is, indeed, any form of left-wing environmentalism needs to be unconditionally supported. In the same way that other particularist forms of struggle have to be unconditionally supported. For example, the wide range of identity politics, identity struggles that so much suited much of action worldwide these days, and certainly in the United States and the UK, I would argue that they should be unconditionally supported in various forms of political alliance formation. However, that does not mean that we should not be fundamentally critical of what it is they do, in order to at least try to shift the terrain from further deepening this kind of techno-managerial, post-political, post-democratic configuration towards politicizing ends. And that requires, of course, a major intellectual task, not just of academics, but a wide range of people who talk, speak, and write, etc., to carefully think through what is going on and how these alliances can be shifted towards politicizing ends that have a better chance of at least marginally altering the socio-ecological parameters of capitalism, which the present situation does not do at all. So on the one hand, yes, in terms of everyday political tactical strategies, unconditional support. No radically disagreeing with what many stand for in terms of the kind of fantasies, analysis, and proposals they keep on repeating. So to put it very simple, I very much disagree with Greta Thunberg and Youth for Climate. On the other hand, it's one of the most promising and fantastic forms of rebellion that we've seen in many, many years. The same for Extinction Rebellion. I radically disagree, a bit less than with Thunberg and Youth for Climate. I do think they're problematic in what they do. Nonetheless, is the very best we got. There's nothing else there. The very best that we got. And what we can do, I think, is to try to think through and demonstrate how strange alliances can be formed. For example, I did a little book in Dutch on climate action in yellow vests. And the sort of attempts to try to construct a difficult alliance between the yellow vest movement in France, who allegedly emerged, sprang up over an alleged eco-tax on gasoline, right? But how, in fact, we could see in France and other places an alliance forming between elements of the yellow vest movement on the one hand and the ecological movement on the other hand. And that's where I see promising possibilities of coalition formation, but that is predicated upon shifting the terrain of discourse, of imaginary and analysis. And that's what I'm trying to suggest. You know, we have to shift the gaze from the dominant way in which we explain, argue, and account for the socio-ecological situation that we're in, to a different set of understandings, practices, and explanations if we want to have any sort of hope to construct a performative alliance. But the performative alliance is one that manages to nudge the situation a bit, let alone a radical shift, but nudge it to a configuration that takes count of the combined and uneven socio-ecological catastrophe that we're witnessing every day. I'm not too optimistic, actually, to be honest. I'm not optimistic at all. But on the other hand, that's the only hope there is. I have faith in its possibility. That's all I can have. Yeah. and anyway, yeah, just leave it with that.
Ari, do we have any questions?
Not at the moment. So I'd like to encourage everybody, if they have questions, to either take the word if they want to speak, or simply type in the chat before we ask our own questions. No, doesn't seem to have anything. Kosi, have you got anything? Otherwise, I have a question for Erik.
No, I don't have anything else. I mean, I was so much in agreement with what Erik was saying, so I don't have anything else.
Okay, so I do then, and I'd like to express a kind of both theoretical and practical dilemma. You used the term of, you talked about depoliticizing signifiers, and you had a list of, catchy terms: sustainability, mitigation, transition, resilience, right? Yeah. Keep doing all the time, and there is no urban agenda in Europe that does not have it. Okay. Yeah. So I was saying, you are, in the city of Amsterdam, and you have people who are proud of what they're doing to make it sustainable and not dependable on I don't know, on petrol. And at the same time, this same city is depleting resources in other parts of the world and actually making the life of other people worse. Yeah. And what I see here, first of all, we have a question of scale, which is very interesting. So people think of the city as a kind of a closed unit. They don't see how the city itself depends on its life from other systems very far away. Yeah. And you realize very often that what people lack, before they even go into the more complex thinking that you have presented, what people lack is a kind of geographical imagination. So what they lack is this understanding that there is an interconnection between that Amsterdam that is growing green and that Chile that has to go into worse and worse living conditions, environmental conditions, labor conditions, and so on. Yes. So it's more of an open thought, because on the one hand, it's not that we are, I mean, I don't think that's what you're trying to say. We're not against the idea of Amsterdam becoming more sustainable, resilient, etc., etc. Absolutely. The point is that these terms in themselves, the way they're used, are managerial words. They could be politicized, but they're not. Exactly. So they are not per se depoliticized word. It's the way that they're used that is becoming managerial. Sure. So it's more of a comment, and I'd like to have your ideas on that. Is that I think, and that is, a geographer's trade. We need to train people, some kind of an activist themselves. An urban activist, because urban activists tend to think of the city and tend to forget that the city is linked to the world. Sure. To train urban activists in some kind of a global thinking and some kind of a geographical imagination, to be able to understand that their local urban action has effects on other places around the world. And so this is just a kind of rambling off without structure. And I see that we have questions on Facebook, and I was hoping that Yorgos was checking Facebook. Okay, so Erik, if you have anything to add to that.
Thank you for that comment, because I actually think that your comment points at the core of what I was trying to convey, which is the following. Of course, I very much agree with you. And as a geographer, I do try through research and education instill this geographical imaginary that you allude to. And that is important. I am certainly not going to argue that we should not do that. In fact, we should continue to do so, and more so than we are presently doing. What I am questioning is the assumption of ignorance that underpins the call for the production or instilling a geographical imaginary with activists and other people, which is predicated upon the assumption that they do not know. I dispute that. I dispute that. And that's precisely why I was making the case of, in addition of thinking of a politics of knowledge, to consider a politics of enjoyment. I do the test very often with my students in Manchester when I teach political ecology, right? Which is precisely about instilling a geographical imaginary, in the sense that what is happening to their lives in Manchester is connected to what is happening to the life of people in the Andes or China or whatever else. So I ask them, and it works wonderfully well. These are 18-year-old kids, right? Do you ever go shopping in Primark? Primark is a UK clothing chain where you can buy shirts for £1 a pop, you know, and trousers for £5. It's a very, very cheap, very, very popular clothing shop. So all of my students, without a single exception, and I do occasionally buy there too, goes there to buy their clothes because they're cheap, etc. Then I ask them, do you have any idea where that stuff comes from? And under what kind of socio-ecological conditions people manufacture that stuff? And of course, they all know. They all know, they're not idiots. They disavow that knowledge. That is what I think is at stake. That's what I was trying to highlight, and why I was trying to mobilize Lacanian psychoanalytic thought, which is precisely about teasing out the mechanisms of repression. That is, despite the fact we know full well that the city life is embedded in global uneven configuration, everyone knows that. That it is, so my argument is that something else at stake. There's something else being worked through that actually does lead to a willful not knowing of what is going on.
That's the cognitive dissonance you were talking about.
Yes, right? The cognitive dissonance. That's a willful unknowing, which permits life to go on as normal, so to speak. Because if one would live life with the full knowledge, life becomes unbearable, impossible. You can't any longer move. I mean, people like you and I who are conscious, who have that geographical imagination, I can't go to a shop anymore if I were to be to take knowledge of everything that's going on. Life would be unbearable. So there's something else going on, and that's why I think knowledge, or instilling this geographical imaginary, however important it is, I'm certainly not denying its importance, but that is not good enough, and certainly does not any longer work as a base to produce forms of the political action that takes count of these socio-ecological inequalities. So that would be my answer. It's not just about knowledge.
Thank you. I have two questions on Facebook, and if you don't mind, I can ask them both, and then you can, can answer them one after the other or together.
Okay.
One is by Anastasia Andreola, who's asking, how can we adopt behaviors in the direction of environmental protection if we have to struggle for our survival and keep producing in a competitive context?
Yeah.
Without the certainty that the basics for a livelihood, actually for a decent life, the only thing we can do is to accumulate as much as we can. Yeah. Economic growth is one way street in such terms.
Yeah.
So that's one question. Should I put the second?
Yeah, it's fine.
The second is by Marilena Mela. Thanks a lot for a very interesting and important presentation. Would you like to comment on the politics and geopolitics of the energy transition and the way this is being communicated, embraced, and implemented in various places in Europe and beyond? We'll take these two, and I'll take some others that came in afterwards.
Okay, yeah, thank you. On the first question, I hope I understood it well, because there were two aspects of the question, it seemed to me. On the one hand, is that how can we adopt a behavior, or adapt or change a behavior? Now, that is part of the dominant environmental doctrine, so to speak, that we can only move towards an ecologically more sensible configuration if we change our individual behavior in the direction of consuming less, for example, not flying any longer, recycling what we do, etc. And of course, these are all good things to do, but we all know it ain't gonna work. So it's not individual behavior, however important it is, that will generate the beginning of a transition. So I very much therefore agree with the second part of the question, that as long we are living in a socio-ecological configuration that is predicated upon accumulation for accumulation's sake, growth for growth's sake, etc., nothing will change, right? Now, that then opens up a very clear, to me, tactical strategy, right? I mean, it's very easy to say that we don't want to live in a system where accumulation for accumulation's sake and exploitation is the dominant way through which we organize our social and ecological life. But how the hell do you begin to change it, right? Now, we all know, and that's where I think an anti-capitalism and environmental politics can find a potential common ground, that capitalism hinges on the private ownership of non-human nature. It's as simple as that. So the process of commoning, or of making common non-human nature, should be objective number one, which therefore, in a situation where every nook and cranny of the world is privately owned, all non-human stuff on Earth, with a few exceptions, is privately owned, we have to find a system of dispossessing the possessors of non-human nature as the very beginning upon which a possible change can happen. As long as we do not address the question of the ownership of non-human stuff, we won't even begin to make a dent in changing the socio-ecological configuration, I think. Yes, I see it. Yes,
actually, there are two interrelated questions, so maybe you could take them together. Which is.
Sorry, let me interrupt you. I wrote them down here on chat.
Yeah, I saw them.
I see them. I see them.
Check them there too. Okay, sorry.
I see them.
So would you like to comment on the politics and geopolitics of the energy transition and the way this is being communicated, embraced, and implemented in various places in Europe and beyond? It's a big question.
That's a big question. That is a
the
big
second one that is linked in a way, because it's also about energy, is could it be argued that the theory of immunity also applies to areas that are forced to install wind turbines that produce much more energy than they consume locally in order to achieve national or supranational goals?
Also applies to areas that are forced to install wind turbines that produce much energy than they consume locally in order to achieve national. Again, thanks for the questions. These are difficult questions to answer. Okay, on the energy transition configuration. First of all, the greatest energy transition that is taking place is through the geographical rearrangement of the production-consumption nexus, right? The fact that in Europe we have been somewhat successful in initiating energy transition, in some places better than others, like in Germany, for example, or the Netherlands, or Norway, who is very successful in its sustainable energy transition precisely because it's pumping up oil that is polluting the rest of the world. It's literally buying its own sustainability and its energy transition by exporting oil and gas and pumping it into the atmosphere. It's one of the most perverse yet interesting examples of an immuno-biopolitical governance regime. Norway is on every international ranking one of the top performers for ecological sustainability and social inclusion, actually. It comes always top on both of those indicators. And if you look at how it produced that, it was primarily by polluting the atmosphere through exporting its gas, oil, and timber. Now, we've done that in Europe on a wider sort of scale. We all know that 70% of our consumption goods, including our mouth masks and our ventilators these days, come from China. That's why it took so long to get bloody mouth masks in, because they had to come from bloody China, as if we'd forgotten how to make some mouth masks. Now, that was just a symptom, of course, of a process that's been going on for the past 20 years or so, where a massive geographical displacement has taken place, where production has been decamped to China in the first place, and a number of other regions to be consumed here. Now, have you looked at China's greenhouse gas emissions and how they keep on going up, and how China keeps on scrambling for coal, and not just coal, other energy too, in order to fuel the factory of the world, to fuel our consumption. I mean, 70% of what I consume comes directly from China or places like that. And that is not a beginning of a dent in greenhouse gas emissions in places like China, and it's not likely to go on to happen anytime soon. In fact, greenhouse gas emissions keep on going up. Coal-fired energy stations are still being built in China to make sure that we can keep on consuming. So much of our carbon emissions are displaced elsewhere. That's part again of the combined and uneven situation, which of course makes it somewhat easier to engage in an energy transition here. At least some countries who have made political decisions to do so, because the goals that need to be achieved are indeed less ambitious than they would otherwise be if all our consumer goods would have been manufactured in Europe. That's one. Secondly, and again, I don't want to make a principled argument again against the green transition. If you consider Germany is the most successful national economy where there has been a national policy to accelerate the energy transition away from not only fossil fuels but also nuclear, which was in addition to its environmental objectives, was clearly also inspired and motivated by Germany's economic policy. By investing in energy transition technologies, it was literally buying itself a competitive advantage on a global scale for what they know will be the technologies of the future. So in many ways, it is an explicit economic technological strategy to build a competitive edge so that accumulation for accumulation's sake can be sustained around a different set of technologies. What we all know is that these different technologies that fuel the energy transition have not once so far led to a energy substitution. In other words, the fossil fuel energy sources have kept on going. What the energy transition technologies have achieved is that the growth of energy demand has been to a certain extent captured by more environmentally friendly technology. So in other words, the energy transition is almost invariably embedded in indeed a set of geopolitical and geoeconomic strategies. And there is at this moment not a shred of evidence, that the alternative non-fossil fuel based technologies would be able to replace the enormous energy demand, most of which, over 95% worldwide, is still met by fossil fuels. The only technology that I could see potentially being enough to fuel energetically the mad dance of accumulation is nuclear energy. And that's why we see that indeed many ecological modernizers actively try to advocate the construction of nuclear energy plants in the name of saving the environment. And for someone like me, this is of course irony driven at the top, right? Because the environmental movement and my own sort of socio-ecological activism emerged with a battle in the 1970s against nuclear energy installations, a battle we won in the 1980s, 1990s. To now see them return in the name of saving the planet. You know, the irony here is absolutely total. So again, at the end of the day, the only way in which a more balanced socio-ecological configuration can be constructed is by slowing down accumulation for accumulation's sake, and consequently slowing down its associated energy use, right? That is what the degrowth movement keeps on arguing. The question here is, what are the political strategies and means by which that can be done such that is done in a socio-ecologically balanced and inclusive sort of way? And that can only mean taking away a lot of energy and resources from some people and giving it to others. That's no other way that I can think of. Yeah. The energy owners have to be dispossessed to a certain extent so that the energy poor ones can catch up somehow in an overall system in which growth is not any longer the obsessive objective that is required in order to sustain the cohesion of a capitalist society. I mean, that is its basic contradiction, of course, that the very cohesion of society is predicated upon the need for economic growth. And we don't even have the beginning of an imaginary politics and a set of associated technologies of institutions through which we can think of the possibility of simultaneously slowing down growth and addressing the profound and increasingly deepening socio-ecological inequalities through which people are dying. You know, if I think of the people who died of COVID-19 the past year or so, it's peanuts compared to the people who die every year from other socio-ecological conditions. That's why we don't hear about Africa and the COVID-19 pandemic. It's kind of black spot, right? Other than South Africa and the Arab states. But sub-Saharan Africa, it is as if COVID is not happening there, right? As if it's not an issue. We hear the occasional, the president of Tanzania died probably of COVID-19, etc. Well, if you talk to local people, COVID is just a disease among many, many others. You know, they've been living with diseases that are lethal for so long. Malaria, dengue, etc. COVID, yes or no, doesn't make any difference in the everyday experience. You know, people die of all sorts of diseases, preventable ones, every day. It's part of everyday life. That's why the COVID-19 pandemic does not have the same symbolic charge and consequence in Africa as elsewhere, although undoubtedly the infection rates are arguably higher than elsewhere.
But I think you've also answered the second question about, you know, local energy production and global consumption of energy. So you sort of bridge the two, or do you want to add something to it?
Well, not particularly, but indeed, I think it's absolutely vital that we take seriously the geographical imaginaries that Alice was talking about earlier, and that I would argue most people actually do know and do understand. Everyone has seen the gigantic boat that was stuck in Suez. Everyone has seen and everyone knew what was in it: the mouth masks, the respirators, the washing machines, etc. for consumption. It was coming to Rotterdam. Everyone knew that these gigantic boats were bringing our consumption goods. It doesn't take no genius. You don't even have to be a geographer to understand that that is indeed going on. So what is absolutely vital indeed is that the policy configuration gets out of that geographical fetishism. So almost every policy configuration along environmental and socio-ecological matters thinks the city indeed, or the region or the country as an isolated territory, so to speak. And its whole accountancy configurations, its carbon budgeting is calculated. It's a politics of calculation. Is calculated upon the territorial base, therefore willfully ignoring and excluding and disavowing what they full well know, which is the flow configuration. Now, it doesn't take a genius to think of an accountancy regime, a politics of measuring and counting that includes the flow, the life cycle, so to speak. And you would immediately come up with a completely different set of technologies, instruments, institutional organizations, etc., to manage that. Nonetheless, that is completely silenced, even among academics. There are very few who actually work on the principle and the practices of having a bloody spreadsheet. It's about spreadsheets at the end of the day. that is predicated upon a flow accounting system rather than a territorial accounting system, right? And I mean, each time when I talk to policy makers in cities, etc., and I suggested to them, they look at me and say, that's an interesting idea, but we can't do it. And then I why can't you do it? So we don't have the technology, the means to do it. And it's like, you're not but idiots, you know? No, I can come up with something. Give me a year and I come up with some sort of system that will more or less give you an accounting of the carbon budget of whatever, mouth masks or respirators or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a sort of territorial fetishism that indeed mitigates against, but in a willful way, in a conscious unknowing that is insufficient with respect to what they do know is actually the flow configuration upon which the sustainability of every city and places on Earth depends.
Okay.
So let's ask others to join, although I can see that Erik could be, let's say, tired by now.
It's also 5 minutes to 9, and I haven't got any more questions in the chat, either at Facebook nor in Zoom.
Yeah. So we had, I believe, a very interesting discussion.
May I add one last thing, if I may?
Okay, I mean, it's not a question or comment to restart.
No. It's just an image that popped up while Erik was speaking, when he was talking about the immunitarian logic. I was thinking of a short story by Edgar Allan Poe called The Mask of the Red Death. I don't know if you remember it, but it's worth reading it. It's supposed to be in the Middle Ages, and it's this nobility that is celebrating in its castle why the Red Death is killing everybody outside. Mm-hmm. And they hope that the big castle and the big walls will protect them from the Red Death. And there's this huge party with masks inside the palace. Mm-hmm. But the Red Death managed to come in as a death wearing a mask and killing all the nobility. So that was the image I had, and I just wanted to put it at the very end.
Yeah, thank you, because indeed I did not have time to go into that. The immunological logic does not work. Mm-hmm. It undermines itself.
Of course, doesn't work.
Your story indicates.
Yeah, it doesn't work.
No.
Okay. Anyway, Erik, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
It was a terrific talk. You generate a very active and very lively discussion. I think it's one of the few seminars that we went until 9 o'clock. So that was a good achievement. At least we are among ourselves sustainable in terms of interest and going ahead. So we thank a lot again, and we hope at least to see you in person sometime.
I really hope so too. I'm really looking forward to hug you all, and I'm waiting the Cipro and the Iraqi sometime soon in a bar in Athens or elsewhere.
We are waiting. They are waiting.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, for participating.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Okay.
See you soon.